Hello again. In this video we will be laying the main roof deck with resin and chopped strand mat, which I will now shorten to the initials c.s.m. In the previous series of videos we have prepared the roof for this stage, and it's now cured enough after 30 minutes to work with again. It's now past the initial soft waxy stage and is dry and tough enough to touch. If you're new to fiberglassing, just check your bandages to make sure you have no wisps of resin or mat sticking up in the air, as this will hinder the next stage. If you do find any, either sand them down or cut them off. If you're sanding, use 40 to 60 grade grit paper, but make sure the laminate is hard enough to sand by pressing your thumbnail into the bandage. If it doesn't mark or indent, you're safe. Next, we're going to want to pre-cut your c.s.m. to length so that you have it on hand and ready to go when you start laminating later on. If the roof's large enough to stand on, then you can roll it out and cut it to length in situ. On smaller roofs, it's probably easier to measure and cut on the floor, as is in the case with this small roof. But before I cut any c.s.m. to size, let me just explain where I will be cutting my c.s.m. and why. Some fiberglass suppliers and roofers measure their c.s.m. so that it finishes onto the flat part of the roof deck just before the raised part of the raised edge trim. And that will be perfectly fine as long as it's a minimum of 50mm onto the surface of the trim. A lot of times though, I prefer to measure my c.s.m. so that it returns up the face of the upstand or up the upstand and onto the top edge of the trim itself. It's a personal preference, but I like the idea that it reinforces the trim itself and removes the laminate join above flat roof level and out of potential laying water. And that's the way I will be laminating this deck, just so you can see the results. Here I'm measuring the decking to get the length required for cutting. Then I'm cutting the c.s.m. to length on the floor with a pair of heavy duty scissors, but a sharp Stanley knife will work just as well. Just make sure that you keep your matting clean and dry and away from any sources of moisture or contaminants. As you can see, if I lay the matting in place on the roof deck, this is the position I'm going to laminate this in later on. On the right hand side I will laminate up the raise of the raised edge trim, and on the left I will be up the raised edge trim and onto the top of the trim itself. Again, you don't have to do this, but it's just there so that you can see it's a viable option if you want to follow suit. If it's a large roof, it may pay to mark a few pencil lines onto the surface of the roof like this. That way, if you're rolling your laminate out onto the resin later, it's a visible guide to stay parallel and make sure that you're not wandering offline or overlapping too little or too much. Next, I'm cutting the c.s.m. to overlap the other matting by a minimum of 50mm and return up the rear of the wall fillet. If you do need a feather edge to hide possible visible edges in the finished job, simply rip the c.s.m. carefully down the pencil line. I've now placed all the matting in place on the roof so I know it will fit later. Any overlapping joint in the c.s.m. overlaps by a minimum of 50mm like this. And here you can also see I've made sure that the feathered edge of the front matting overlaps the rear one, so the sharp edge here will not be visible in the final laminate. When you're happy with the final finish, roll the matting up and place it in order either on the roof or on the floor, where you can simply pick it up and lay it in sequence. Now's a good time to check that your roof is clear and probably give it a final sweep. Just for informational purposes, I will be laminating this roof with 450 grams c.s.m, which will require about 4 to 5 litres of resin, with a summer catalyst at a ratio of 2%. And if you need further information on any of this, please see the website links in the description bar or at the end of the video. As we learnt in the last video, preparation is the key to a nice finish and a stress-free working environment. And as before, resins, top coats and catalysts have been kept cool in the shade on this very changeable but hot and sunny day. And as in the last video, rather than me talk about catalyst temperatures and resin ratios, just follow the link at the end of the video or in the description bar. I have a choice of 3 consolidating rollers ready to hand. two 230mm or 9-inch paddle rollers, one with a large diameter for the main roof deck if I chose, and one small diameter in case I want to get into the trim details, and an old fin roller, which is what I will be using as it's just a small demo roof and it's not really worth getting the other two consolidating rollers dirty for, but they're there and they're on hand if I want them. As for the rest of the kit, I've got two 15-litre paint scuttles marked internally in litres that are just out of shot, and I will only be using the one. The other one there is just as a spare. One 100mm or 4-inch mini roller in case I need it, one 230mm or 9-inch resin roller for applying the resin to the deck and the c.s.m, and a cheap 50mm or 2-inch paintbrush just in case. Roofing resin, catalyst and a syringe, which as you know is my favourite technique for adding catalyst to resin. As before in the last video, please wear protective clothing, especially full wraparound eye protection. Right, let's get started. Now drawing up 100ml of summer grade catalyst, and as you can see it's been injected under the surface of the roof resin for fast mixing. A thorough stir with a square edge mixing stick, getting into all the corners as well. There you go, done. Here I'm wetting out the deck. I've chosen to work from the back of the roof forwards, and this could be exactly the same on a larger roof. Don't forget to wet the face of any trims where the c.s.m will mate with it later. Now, I'm not wetting the whole decking here simply because I don't want to lean over a fully wet deck later, and I know exactly where the c.s.m is going because I marked it with a pencil earlier. I'm just pressing the c.s.m into place as it's far too small to roll out realistically. Now it's more resin on top until there are no dry spots visible. Now I've switched to the mini roller to get into any sharp angles, like against the upstand edges. It's the same procedure for the other side, but it's getting a little bit easier now because the roller is fully soaked in resin. Again, make sure you wet out all the nooks and crannies. The other section of the mat goes into place and overlaps the other by a minimum of 50mm. Yet more resin on top and push through the mat until all areas are covered. Once again, the mini roller does a lovely job of the details, and notice I'm laminating the very top of the trim on this side. Roughly 60 seconds has passed now and the laminate has started to turn transparent, so I'm using the consolidating roller on the area I've just done. 2 or 3 passes up and down will remove all the air bubbles from the laminate. When I'm happy with the result, I just pass over the surface again with the roller to get it as flat as possible. Add a little more resin if you think it needs it. Now I'm going to wet out the remaining roof deck, and it's much easier to laminate large areas than it is with the small details. Get enough resin on so that roof looks comfortably wet without puddles of resin all in one place. Now roll out your c.s.m into the wet decking and we can start again. Here I've started to use the pour and roll technique, which personally I find faster. Pour it on and roll the excess resin to somewhere that looks dry, then pour some more on and repeat. There is a downside to this though. If you're going to use this method, it's important to monitor the quality of resin in your bucket. If it starts to show any signs of thickening, go and get a fresh mix. If you accidentally pour lumpy semi-activated resin onto your roof, you won't be happy. Again, the small roller comes out for the details. It hasn't taken long now and we're on the very last bits. As long as you haven't mixed too much resin or put too much catalyst in, there's no problem at all. You can see the laminate turning transparent once again, so we know it's nearly time to consolidate. If you're doing a larger roof or you're inexperienced, it can be easier to assign a person to the mixing and consolidating, while another applies resin and laminates. Here, on the other side of the trim, I've laminated the c.s.m up the face of the upstand. Now I'm consolidating again. 2 to 3 passes over the laminate will suffice. You can actually hear a change in the laminate as the air leaves, and when you do this you will know exactly what I mean. When it looks and sounds bubble free, it will be. Once again, I tend to pass over the laminate one last time after consolidation with a wet roller. It's not strictly necessary, but it makes everything flat and knocks any sticky uppy bits back down. As you can see, you can actually be surprisingly delicate even with a large roller like this. And there we are, done. If I just put my camera down to the surface of the laminate, you can see that there are no pinholes or dry spots in the face of the laminate. Now the roof is fully laminated and we just have to wait for it to cure. And it's going to pass through 3 distinct curing stages. The first stage will normally be somewhere between 15 to 40 minutes. It will be dry to the touch but not hard if you press your thumbnail firmly into the laminate. This is the stage I cut off any excess matting off the edge of a trim with a sharp Stanley knife. It will trim up at this stage but will not withstand sanding. Drip removal from trims is also very easy now if you have any. Stage 2 normally occurs at somewhere between 30 minutes and an hour. If you press or scrape your thumbnail into the laminate at this stage, it feels hard and it will not indent even under firm pressure. It will still trim up at this point, but it becomes hard work. But it's now ideal for sanding off any rough edges or applying the top coat. This stage will last for up to 24 hours and all efforts should be made to top coat within this time frame. Stage 3 happens at the 24 hours and above range. The roof deck is now very hard and cured. If for some reason you haven't top coated before now, you will need to thoroughly sand the surface all over with 40 to 60 grade before applying any top coat. As this roof is only 20 minutes old, I'm going to trim the excess laminate to the upstand like this. And remove some drips on the face of the trim. A blunt Stanley blade or even better a blunt chisel will do this effortlessly. Well, that brings this video to an end and I'll see you in the next and final video, which is top coating. See you there.